Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Logic Apps Live BizTalk Migrator edition. It's a pleasure to be back. We've been on hiatus for a couple of months, the last one being in June. And now we've got a November edition, which we have a lot of fun new announcements and demos to go through today. So thanks for joining, and thanks for joining on the recording, and we'll get started. Before we go jump into the meaty goodness, just a couple of updates. We had Ignite previously earlier in the month, and lots of fun updates on the Logic App side. So some to note, we've gone live with our new SQL database as a storage provider for Logic App Standard. That's now in public preview. We've also added managed identity support for Logic App Standards, as well as enhancements to consumption support. We've added a new feature called replication tasks, which allows you to easily replicate your different messages between different queuing and messaging systems. Our Flatfire connector is now available in standard, so give that a go. And we are coming soon with our consumption to standard export experience. So if you've always wanted to use standard, but you were trying to figure out a way to move your consumption to the new standard SKU, then that will be available very soon. And if you want to check out more of those updates, you can head to aka.ms/logicapps-ignite blog. So give that a read and we'll give that a go. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Daniel, who's going to walk through some of the latest and greatest updates in the BizTalk Migrator tool, as well as what's coming next. So over to you, Daniel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a run-through or a walkthrough, I guess, of version 1.0 of the BizTalk Migrator. We're a lot to cover, so we'll get going. Tonight, we're going to talk about what's new in version 1.0, how to install it. We'll do a demo of running and deploying it and have a look around what gets deployed up in Azure. We'll talk about the current limitations, and then we'll talk about what's next. And then afterwards, I'm hoping Beck will open up to Q&A if possible. Right, first of all, feedback. We need you to tell Microsoft what you want. So please either fill in the survey at aka.ms BizTalk Migration Survey. And there's questions on there about, what you'd like to see next in the tool. Or email us, email Microsoft at biztalkmigration@microsoft.com. Or you can go onto the main repo on GitHub, which is github.com/azure/aim-tool/issues, and you can just raise an issue on there if you've got a question or there's a feature you'd like to see. Microsoft used this to help work out where the tool should go, what should be done next, what would make this tool, really, really good for you to use. Righto, let's get straight into this. What is new in version 1.0? Well, we have new deployment scripts. So the deployment experience, not deployment of the tool, but deployment of the resources up to Azure has changed. And in my mind, it's a better experience because it walks you through what you need to do. So it's an interactive experience, effectively. I'll show an example of that. Then there's a new config cache updater, Logic App. So as you might know, a lot of configuration is stored in Azure App Configuration. So, configuration entries for each Logic App or the routing slip. And that information is cached in API management, which means that if you change it in Azure App Config, you have to manually refresh the cache. Now you don't have to do that. The config cache updater will automatically refresh the cache for you using an event grid trigger. The headline is that the tool now supports Logic App Standard as a target. And that means that all the existing consumption Logic Apps have been replaced with standard Logic App workflows. There's a couple of caveats to this that we'll talk later on, but that's more about what standard supports rather than the tool itself. The tool now supports light targets. So this was a suggestion from Eldert, who's an MVP. Hi, Eldert. And I think I understood his suggestion, but I took it to mean this, which I think is actually a great idea, which is that if you're deploying multiple BizTalk applications and you're not doing them all at the same time in the tool, so you're doing them maybe one at a time, every time you run the tool, it outputs both your application and all the core resources, the message bus and the system application. And they're the same for every BizTalk application that you convert. And if you have to do a deployment each time, it takes a while. So what Light does is it only emits the resources needed for your application. So it makes an assumption that you have already done a full deployment. So you've done a full deployment and you've got the message bus and system application resources, API management, app config, key vault, storage, all that's there. So all you have to do is add in the things for your BizTalk application. And it means that the deploy time drops drastically. So if you do a full deployment, it can be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour 20. Most of that is API management. If you do a full deployment on top of an existing deployment, it takes about 27 minutes to 35 minutes. But now if there's a light one, if you're just doing a light deployment, so just a single MSI and just the application that's in there, that takes about 6 minutes to do a deployment. So it's a lot quicker. But it does assume a full deployment exists. If you haven't done a full deployment first, then the light deployment will fail. A new adapter, SFTP, we demoed this last month. The SAP and MQ adapters are on their way. They're in beta testing at the moment. If you really want to play with them, please email us on that email address you saw earlier, and we'll see if we can get you access to them. Deploying the tool. I would say the best way of deploying the new version is to uninstall the existing version. And you do that with a choco uninstall BizTalk Migrator, and then you do a -X, and that will mean it will also uninstall all the related packages, and then a --force, and that will force it to do an uninstall even if it's changed. The BizTalk Migrator is made up of 3 different packages, so you have to use the -X to tell it to uninstall them. Then deploy the new version with choco install BizTalk Migrator -- version 1.0.0. The packages are still going through moderation at the moment on Chocolatey. It's a manual process and it can take a little while. Once they've gone through moderation, you don't really need the -- version. It will just install the latest version. But at the moment, I would suggest using that. You could also upgrade your existing version if you have it already installed. This is a little bit more work because you first of all need to do a choco upgrade, and then you specify the names of the packages, which are BizTalk Migrator, BizTalk Migrator -CLI, and BizTalk Migrator -Azure, and then you give the version with a -- version 1.0.0. That will upgrade all the packages, but there's another step that is run automatically for you when you do an install, but does not seem to be run when you do an upgrade. And that is, there is a Chocolatey install PowerShell script file that needs to run, and that sets up the app settings file with the location of the BizTalk Migrator package. So if you open a administrative PowerShell prompt, then you can navigate to wherever you've got Chocolatey, which is normally C, program data, Chocolatey, and then go to lib, BizTalk Migrator, tools, and then run that PS1 file there. And then that will set it all up. So you can also do that as well. That'll all achieve the same thing. But the easiest thing is to uninstall the current version, install a new version. Doing the tool. So the only real thing that has changed is that there is a new a new target option. If you've run the tool before, you probably haven't specified a target. The tool used to support consumption and ICE, and it defaulted to consumption. It still defaults to consumption. So if you want to use standard, you have to go -- target standard. If you want to use one of the light options, it would be -- target standard light or -- target consumption light. And if you do aim -- help, it will give you a help file that explains all this. And it's also in the documentation as well, and the change log. Unique deployment ID obviously needs to stay there as well, because that's how we identify this install versus anyone else's install. Side note, if you don't include the unique deployment ID, it will generate a 5-character one for you. All right, so new deployment scripts. So if you've done the deployment up to Azure before, you'll know that there's a deploy all PS1 and tear down all PS1 files. And you would run those from a command prompt or anywhere that you have the Azure CLI installed. One of the issues that we found is that if you're not familiar with the Azure CLI, you could have selected a subscription you hadn't intended to select. And so when you run these files, it will start deploying to the wrong subscription, which can be problematic. So what we've done now is there's a new deploy all.bat file and tear down -all.bat file, and they will run the PS1 files for you. So that's one new thing. You don't have to go to a PowerShell command prompt. You can just double click those files or go into a command prompt and run them. The second thing is deploy all now runs in interactive mode by default. What that does is it takes you through a number of steps. It explains what it's going to do, and you push a button to continue. and then it will make sure that the Azure CLI is installed and the various extensions are installed. It will give you a list of subscriptions that you have access to. And if you only have one subscription, then it will tell you the name of that to make sure that you're aware of this is where it's deploying to. And then at the end, it will get you to confirm that you want to proceed. You can still run an unattended mode if you want to. So you can just run either the deploy all unattended.batch file, or you can run the deploy all PowerShell file with a parameter of run unattended with a value of 1. That's all the batch file does for you. Let's give you a demo of how all this works. So I'm going to come through here to my command prompt. I'm hoping you can see all this. I'm going to uninstall my current version of the tool. BizTalk migrator -x -- force. And that should go. One of the things I should have said is you'll need to be an administrator command prompt, so an elevated permissions, run as administrator. And that's because Chocolatey needs to read and write to a certain folder, which needs administrative or elevated privileges to install, only during installation time, not when you run the tool. So it's uninstalled all the packages. Now we can install the new version. So we can go choco, install, BizTalk, migrator, -- version 1.0.0. Make sure we haven't made any mistakes. We haven't. And off it will go. So what it's going to do, it's going to download 3 packages, and then it's going to run a PowerShell script file. There we go. That's the first package. And then the CLI package, and then the Azure package. There we go. All right. And then it says, do you want to run the PowerShell file? We do, because that sets up all the paths. And it's done. Brilliant. So now I'm going to go to my Windows terminal here, and I'm going to run the tool. Now, running the tool here, I've got a single sample MSI. This is the one from the scenarios, the sample scenarios that come with the tool. And you can see I've got -- target standard here as well. So I can run the tool and off it will go. We get a whole lot of stuff output, including something in here you can see is now a WF002 standard workflow generator. All right. So it's run, and we can see it's an AIM 22024 is the name of the folder. So I will go and find that folder, 22024, and that is right here. So we can see that we've got all the standard report stuff here as well, but we've also, if we double click in here, we can see we've got some new batch files that I mentioned earlier. And if I run one of these, the deploy all batch, I can double click it and it brings up a window here. It always opens the other screen. And it's telling you a couple of things. It's using PowerShell Core. Now this is quite important. If you're doing a standard deployment, you need either PowerShell Core or PowerShell version 5.2 or above. And that's because the deployment for Azure uses some JSON features in PowerShell. So this batch file is actually checking you've got the correct version of PowerShell installed. So we're using PowerShell Core. It's telling you that we're using a Logic App standard, and it's telling you what it's going to do. So do you have the Azure CLI installed? Is the Logic App extension installed? So there's actually a CLI extension for Logic App standard. It's new and it's in preview. And this will install it if you don't have it. It will install a preview version anyway. Then it will check if you can log in and have you selected a subscription and is everything else set up. So I'm going to go OK, and let's see what it does. Yes, I have the CLI installed, and I've got version 0.1.1 of the extension installed. Now it's popping up a browser window and asking me to select a login. So I will do that. That's on my other screen here. So we come back, we can see I'm going to select this. And now it says I can close the window. And in a few seconds, it will show me the subscriptions I have access to. Now, in this login, I have 2 subscriptions, but if I only had 1, it would actually skip this step. It wouldn't show me this list. It would simply say the name of the subscription and move on. Now, I can select the default one here just by pushing return, which I'll do. To highlight the window first, push return, there we go. And then is app configuration done? And then, okay, so now it's checking, is there a free SKU app configuration installed? There is by the tool. and it already has the same unique deployment ID. So it's just warning us to make sure that if we try to deploy with a different unique deployment ID, we'd get an error because it would say there's already a free SKU app configuration installed. So do you want to continue the deployment? Well, yes, I do. I won't do that right now. It takes about 35 minutes, this one here, because it's deploying over the top. But luckily, I have one I did earlier. And the other thing the tool does now, if I come back to the other one, at the end, it will tell you how long it took to run. So in this case, it took 27 minutes. And you can push any key to close the window. Brilliant. Okay, so that's what it looks like installing and running the tool. One thing I'll just quickly mention now that I meant to mention at the beginning is go and have a look at the repo. So this is the AIM tool repo under Azure. And in here, you'll find a link to the changelog. So it says version 1.0 released, and there's the changelog. And everything I'm telling you today is in here. So how to do the deployment or the undeployment and what's new, the sample screenshots and everything. So it's all in here. Everything we're talking about on this presentation. Alrighty, back to the demo. So the config cache updater, that's a new logic app that clears the API management cache when an app configuration entry is modified. So, configuration entry or routing slip. It uses the event grid trigger, watching for changes. For a target of consumption, it uses a consumption logic app and also deploys an API connection and event grid subscription. For a target of standard, it deploys a consumption logic app. And that's because the event grid trigger in Logic App Standard doesn't yet support managed identity, which is what we use. The only other options then are using your own identity, which means you have to go and authorize the API connection, or using a service principal, which can be tricky to set up if you don't have administrative access to Azure Active Directory. So what that means is that there is a standard version of the config cache updater, and it actually does get deployed, but it doesn't work. You'll see an error. The first time it starts up, there's an error in there about authentication, authorization. So we're waiting for managed identity support to arrive, and when it does, then we'll remove the consumption logic app when you're using a standard target, and we'll just use the one that's already deployed. New adapters, SFTP. So send and receive, consumption and standard. It should work the same way as BizTalk, although not all properties are mapped. For example, if you're using certificate authentication, then when you're setting up the certificate properties, they're not in the MSI. So you'll have to go into the API connection and manually set all that up. Right, Logic App Standard support. We covered this last month, but I'll just say it all again in case you're not familiar with Logic App Standard, but it's a new offering from Microsoft. It's built on the functions runtime, and it runs in a single tenant, as in using your own compute resource, so your own CPU and RAM and SSD. Whereas consumption logic apps, by comparison, are multi-tenant, so you share the compute resource with other people or other logic apps. It uses an app service plan for pricing. If you've ever deployed a function or an app service or a mobile app, then you'll be familiar with app service plans. An app service plan is also known as a server farm internally, and it's effectively what type of CPU and how many have you got, or virtual CPU, how much RAM have you got, what SSD. So it's almost like the VM you're running on. And so the prices go up as the amount of resources you use go up. But it's a fix per month for all the Logic apps using that app service plan. There are two supported Logic App Standard service plans, Workflow Standard 1 and Workflow Standard 2. And they're the only ones that have an SLA for Logic apps. You can technically run Logic App Standard on other app service plans, but they're not supported. But if you wanted to, for development purposes, decrease the cost, you could do that. You can also develop and run Logic App Standard locally in VS Code with the new extension, so you can debug them and run them locally, which is brilliant. And some of the connectors are now built in, so they're not using an API connection. So I was going to say Event Grid, but that's not true. Event Hub and Service Bus and MQ, they're all built in now, and there are more coming. But you can still use, all 300 or 400 connections or connectors from consumption as well. They're accessible as well. And you no longer need an integration account. So schemas and maps are stored directly in the Logic app. Now, a quick word about deployment. So with consumption Logic apps, we would have, say we had 3 logic apps, then you have 3 deployed resources and probably 3 ARM templates for each logic app, or 1 ARM template for each logic app, and then you'll have your API connections, your integration account, and service bus and function app. And then you have a number of functions inside the function app. That's the consumption logic app deployment model. With standard logic apps, it's a little bit different. We still have the resource group, we still have everything else that's the same, but now instead of 3 separate logic apps, we've got 1 logic app with 3 workflows in it. So it's important to know that the word logic app has been overloaded in this case, because in consumption, the logic app is both the workflow and the infrastructure to support that workflow. But in standard, the logic app is just the infrastructure to support, and then the workflows are separate. And so you deploy them separately. You deploy a logic app with an ARM template or bicep template, and it's like an app service, like a function app or an IIS application. And then the workflows are then deployed to that application, generally as a zip file, and you can use Kudu for that or FTP or whatever you want. So you've got to get your head around a slightly different deployment model. And Microsoft talk about, and Beckstar talk on this about infrastructure as code, and it's the idea of separating the two out. So the infrastructure is separate to the code. Righty. Issues with Logic App Standard that affect us at the moment. There's no flat file support yet. We'll talk about that when we talk about the limitations of the tool, but we don't have any flat file support. You can't call a workflow by expression. So I can't, within a workflow, dynamically call another workflow within the same Logic App. Can't do it. It's got to be, the name of the workflow has got to be known at design time. You can't use ARM expressions to calculate parameter values because there's no ARM templates. If you need to get a value from an ARM template or an ARM expression, like a reference to a key or something like that, then you have to put that in the ARM template that deploys the Logic App and put the value in what's called app settings in the Logic App. And we will have another session talking about all this. I know Beck's done a good session already on it. But that's how you would do it. You can access them, but there'll be an app setting, but you're limited with the number of app settings. But you can't use them for the parameters in the Logic App. There's no tokens and parameter files yet, although we'll talk about that coming. And then there's a single shared parameter file for all the workflows in the Logic App. So previously you had parameters that were specific to a Logic App. Now we have a parameter file that is for the Logic App, but shared among all the workflows in the Logic App. So what our tool does is it adds the prefixes the workflow name to the parameter name to indicate that that parameter is for that workflow, where it's specific to the workflow. And then if it's not prefixed with the workflow name, then it's common to workflows. What about integration accounts? So I mentioned earlier, there's no need for integration accounts because now schemas and maps are part of the standard Logic App. But it also means there's no central store. If you think about BizTalk, we have the management database and all our schemas and maps are in there. But with an integration account, we had a similar place to store them. But with Logic App Standard, they're stored in every single Logic App. So what do we do with common schemas and maps? What we decided to do with the tool is we put those in the system application. So the system application has all your schemas and maps in it, and we regard that as a common Logic App. And that means that the workflows that need to access those schemas and maps can access them easily. Another thing that we use integration accounts for is to look up a schema by message type. So when we're doing XML validation, BizTalk has a concept of message type where we take the XML namespace and then the hash character, and then or pound sign, and then we add in the root node name. It's very specific to BizTalk. So what we had to do with integration accounts when we deployed the schemas is we add metadata to each of the schemas so that we can look it up by that. Now we don't have the integration account anymore, so without it, we have no way of looking it up. What we decided to do is keep the integration account, and we still need it because we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the limitations around transforms and why we still need an integration account. So we still have the metadata in there. This little graphic's just showing how, previously in consumption, we have all our schemas and maps in a single integration account and every Logic App can access them. But now our schemas and maps might belong to Logic App 1, but Logic App 2 can't access them directly. Logic App 2 would have to call a workflow in Logic App 1, which would then access the schemas and maps. Deployment, what's changed? So in consumption, we have the message bus resource group with all the common stuff, your config store, routing store, APIM, all the rest. Then your system application, which has the BizTalk specific stuff, JSON decoder, encoder, flat file, the service bus we use for the message box, and then your application. So the receive port, send port, the adapters, your orchestrations that are called process managers, and then the API connections. With standard, what's changed is that we have an app service plan here now, because we don't need the routing slip router anymore, consumption logic app. So we have an app service plan up in here. Then we have a new standard logic app in here that has all these that were consumption logic apps now as workflows. So they're workflows inside this logic app. And then ditto for your application, the BizTalk migrated application. There's a standard workflow in here that's got everything that was deployed as consumption logic apps. They're now deployed as workflows inside that single standard logic app. And then the API connections are still there. Right, costing. Under consumption, we would always use the free or lowest cost SKU. So free integration account, free app configuration. And that's why you sometimes have limitations when you deploy the tool if you're using one of those free accounts already somewhere else, because you only usually have one of those. We use developer SKU for API management and consumption for function apps, and we use standard for service bus. It's all about trying to keep the cost down as much as possible, especially if you're on an MSDN subscription or Visual Studio subscription for your Azure credits. We also tried to look at how we did the polling as well, because being consumption logic apps, you don't want the polling to be too frequent because it puts up the price, how many actions you're doing per day. So we defaulted it to 30 seconds, which is a trade-off between latency and cost. With standard, it's changed slightly. All this stays the same, but now there's a new app service plan. And by default, we're using Workflow Standard 1. Now, here in the UK, that costs £120 a month. And our Visual Studio subscriptions get 75 or 70 pounds of credit a month. So you'll very quickly use up all your credit if you deploy everything here and leave that running. So our suggestion is that you look at either tearing it down once you finish testing with it, or you deploy it to a subscription which is pay as you go, or you look at using a different app service plan. This is something we could talk about with Microsoft, but I don't. Officially, other app service plans are not supported with Logic Apps, although I think they should work. I know they work, but I can't say that really. There's one other thing here is that there's no more service bus polling. So the built-in trigger uses function triggers for service bus. So it gets a response immediately. So there's no cost involved, which is nice. The FTP file and SFTP receive ports still poll. You can make them run as much as you want. They can be every 1 second if you want, and there's no extra cost for doing that in terms of financial cost. But there's extra load on your servers by doing that, and that might not be a good idea. So at the moment, we're using whatever BizTalk said. So if you were polling 30 seconds in BizTalk files, it'll be 30 seconds in the deployed application. Current limitations. This is probably the largest one. BizTalk maps are not supported in Logic App Standard. So Logic App Standard has a map action, so an XSLT action, but it doesn't support BizTalk maps. And the reason for that is that when BizTalk was written, we only had XSLT 1. And Microsoft, in their wisdom, when they wanted to do things that you couldn't do in XSLT 1, some of the functoids at least, they implemented an extension for XSLT 1 that let you put C# in the XSLT, and you'll see that if you open up your BizTalk map or you export this XSLT, you'll see this user C# section. So the XSLT processor in .NET understands that and executes that C# code. And then when maps are brought across to integration accounts, if you select your map as being V1 of XSLT, it uses the .NET processor, and therefore the C# code is run, so BizTalk functoids effectively. But the transform action in Logic App Standard uses Saxon, so it's a different XSLT process, much faster. It supports XSLT 1, 2, 3, 4, but it does not support C#. Because of that, unless you're using a BizTalk map that has no C# in it, which generally means you're not using any functoids, you can't use it. So for that reason, for now, we have to deploy our maps to an integration account, and we have to deploy a consumption logic app, the XML message transform, to execute them, And we have to deploy a consumption routing slip router to support the XML message transform. And that's why, even though you do a standard conversion or migration and you do the deployment, you'll see some consumption logic gaps there. We're talking with the product group about ways around this. One of the ways would be to replace the functoids with their XSLT2 or 3 equivalent, which is much easier to do. There's no XSLT2 or 3 support in .NET, but we could take the code that's output by BizTalk and look at replacing that. Or we could get Microsoft to see if they could support executing BizTalk maps in Logic App Standard. But watch this space. For now, this is what we're doing. There's no flat file support. We talked about this earlier. It's not in standard yet, but it is coming. It's on their backlog. So when it arrives, we'll support it. If you want access to flat files now, we could deploy the consumption logic app like we did with the XML message transform logic app. That would be very easy to do. So if you want that, then let us know, raise an issue or send us an email. We're using stateful workflows for now instead of stateless. Stateless workflows don't have any run history and they don't do persistence out to storage. So in theory, they're quite a bit faster to run. And it's not always the case. We decided for now, at least for our initial release, to use stateful workflows, because if something goes wrong, it's very difficult to see where it happened. You'll get something coming out the end saying there was a problem in a logic app or workflow, but you can't then go to, a workflow further in to find out where. What we'd like to do is get better App Insight support going so that we can log things out as we go, and therefore we could easily switch over to stateless. If you want to switch over to stateless, you can do that actually. It's not that difficult to do. And if you want to know, if you're really interested in doing that, then send us an email or raise an issue and I can update the documentation to show you. It's not yet possible to deploy and run it all locally in VS Code. So you can open up the Logic App Standard projects, but there's no support for Service Bus or app config locally. And although there's APIM support, it's expensive because you need premium SKU and you need a self-hosted gateway. So in order to run everything we've got at the moment in Azure down locally, it's very difficult. And we're looking at how we could make that better. How could we have it so you containerize this application? You can debug some parts locally. So you could take, say, the HTTP receive port or receive location locally and run that. When it then calls the message constructor to do something, it's going to call the message constructor via API management. It goes up to Azure, and from that point onwards, it will all run up in Azure. And it won't ever actually come. I mean, you will eventually get a response back into your local one, but it's not going to run through all the other workflows locally. Demo. Let's go and have a look at standard support. Oh, I've gone too far, haven't I? I did that one. So if we come back to our resource groups here, we've got 3. We've got the message bus, system application, and our application. If we open up our application one, we should see, I'll make this a bit bigger, so my head will be in the way. There's now, where there used to be a whole lot of consumption logic apps, we now have a single logic app, which is a standard one. We open that up, we can see the, how did that not work? There we go. So we've got our workflows, and the 3 workflows in here will be the 3 that used to be consumption logic apps. So there's a receive port, or receive location, there's a orchestration, purchase order processor, and then there is a topic subscriber, which you wouldn't see in BizTalk, but it's effectively your send port, if you like. So that's what we've got. And in fact, if we want to, we can come in here and we can get the workflow URL, and then we can pop over to here to Postman, and then we can test it. That window over. So I'll put in here the new URL, and we'll call it. And this takes about 30 seconds. I'll talk about perf in a little bit, but I'm just going to move that off there while that's running, and you can see there's run history here. I can come back out here and go to the system application, and I'll see there's now a system application logic app, standard logic app. And in here are all the workflows that used to be consumption logic apps. So the JSON encoder and decoder, and there is an XML message transform in here, although we don't really need it because it's not being used. Well, actually, no, we did take it out. So yeah, content demoter and promoter and things like that. Okay, you're all in here. And if you went back up a level, you would have seen now we've got these standard logic apps, the XML message translator. There's also a XML message translator Lite that's used by orchestrations, or the orchestrations get converted to a process manager. And then what this does is obviously that standard logic app needs an ability, if you're using the transform shape in an orchestration, needs the ability to call a BizTalk transform. So that's what this logic app is used for. So it doesn't then go on to call the routing slip router or anything. And then message bus here, we've got our new config cache updater. There we go. So here we go, APIM, we've got our config cache updater as a consumption logic app, and then we've got the event grid topic up here and API connection. And then we also have the standard version of the message bus in here, and that will have a single workflow. Go a second up here. A single workflow in it, which is the config cache updater, which doesn't work. I have an error in it. There we go. Yeah. Alrighty. So that is it. That's what gets deployed for standard. If I come back out of here, I'm just awaiting the HTTP request response to come back, which I sent. There we go. So that's taken 50 seconds, which is quite a long time, but it's worked. We will talk about perf and what we're doing about it. But if I move on here to roadmap, what's planned? Yeah, performance improvements. So yeah, 49 seconds. I mean, it's normally about 30. There's a warm start and stuff going on. We want to get that a lot better. So we're going to be working with the product group on what we can do. The SAP and MQ triggers or adapters are on their way. They should come out very soon. A new core target would be nice. So if we put bug fixes or new functionality in, it might be nice to be able to deploy that without having to run the tool to migrate all your BizTalk applications. You just want to upgrade the common stuff of it. The WCF adapters, specifically the basic HTTP and the web HTTP adapter. We're going to be looking at what we can implement in there. A lot of that will come down to APIM support, but we're hopeful to do quite a bit. Business rules engine, that's a big ask from people. That's mainly a licensing issue, but technically it's possible. We'd have to find a way of getting the vocab and policy out of BizTalk and into the tool, because they do not get included in the MSI as far as I'm aware. I think there might be an option to tell them to include them, but I'm not sure. It's been a while since I looked at that. BAM support's a big one. So BAM support, I mean, BAM is just a set of SQL Server views and tables and stored procedures. And that we could all stick in Azure SQL, or ideally put it in App Insights. But it's the code that pulls your data from, say, an orchestration and updates it, or updates those activities. So, you know, if you're using C# to do that, how do we handle that? How do we handle tracking profiles? So we have to look at what we could do. And then BizTalk deployment framework, MSI support. This is kind of a low-hanging fruit. It should be fairly easy to do. But that's what we've got on our list at the moment. If there's anything more you want to see, please email us. The email address again is biztalkmigration@microsoft.com. And that's it for now. I'll hand it back over to Beck. But thank you all very much for watching, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. That was great to see all the latest and greatest of the BizTalk migration tool. As mentioned, I just want to add again, if there is something that you need or want included in the tool, please hit up that survey link that we added at the beginning. I'll also add it to the chat as well. Or you can just hit us up for feedback at biztalkmigration@microsoft.com. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we want to continue to make this a tool that is relevant for more and more use cases as we go along. I'll just hand back to Daniel just to make a couple of notes on the flat file.
Yep, no worries. Cheers, Beck. Thank you. Yeah, so the flat file is now, if you were paying attention earlier on, flat file support in standard is now there. It's in preview. It's not in GA yet. So we are working on a newer version of the tool that will support that. So we won't need to do flat files via the integration account at all anymore. If you've read the documents on the standard support for flat file, you'll know that you'll still need an integration account if you're doing, you know, partners or certificates or contracts or anything like that. But if you're just doing a fairly simple flat file transform or flat file to XML, you can do it all inside your standard logic app now. And the other thing just to talk about is the XSLT support. So you do need an integration account at the moment, as I talked about, because of the C# support. And one of the things we mentioned earlier was that we could do that by migrating some of the BizTalk functoids to using XSLT 2 or 3. But another way of doing it is to supply a separate function app. And this is probably a better way of doing it, a separate function app that would implement the XSL compiled transform class and basically do exactly what BizTalk does. And that would have the benefit of supporting external assemblies. Plus, we should be able to use the BizTalk map file, the .btm file, as the input rather than the XSLT, because that file has got the custom extension property in it where you reference your fully qualified name of an assembly. So if you've got a helper class, for example, that goes away to a database and does work, we could actually bring that up and deploy that into a separate function app that we supply. So that's something we're actively looking at the moment. It would mean that we wouldn't be doing the transforms inside logic apps, we'd be doing them in a separate function app, but we'd support the full BizTalk functionality. So again, that's something we're actively pursuing. Last thing is just, in terms of what's coming next, if there is something that you would really like to see, if there's, if you're thinking about doing a migration and you're blocked because there's a feature that's not supported, please reach out and let us know, because it might be that we can bump that up the priority list. All right, that's it from me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. So we'll wrap up now. Thank you so much for those who joined live and for those who are joining after the fact on the recording. Please send through your feedback. Let us know what you'd like to see next. And we'll see you on the next installment. Thanks, everybody.